K.Adam is a senior engineer at Boku. Boku, if you don't know, is an agency that works with all the biggest brands you've ever heard of, literally all of them. K.Adam is also the design lead for the WordPress REST API project, and that's what he's going to be talking to us about today. So, K.Adam, the time is yours as soon as the mic's turned on.
Cool. All right, I can hear myself. That's good. You probably can too. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ryan, for the introduction, and thank you for having me at LoopConf. This is really a privilege. It is very rare that you get to pitch a talk advocating that you should do something and then actually deliver the talk retrospectively looking back having done it. This talk was titled Build Your Dreams with the WordPress REST API and JavaScript. It was a deliberately campaigny title. It didn't have a whole lot of substance. I'm honestly surprised they accepted it. And the cool thing is that now we get to look back on what actually happened in the 4.7 cycle and how the REST API came to be in WordPress core. We'll get to the JavaScript, we'll get to the dreams, but because this is a developer audience, because this is an audience that is really interested in how WordPress works and where it's going, I thought that it'd be good to start with a bit of a story about the API itself. And my involvement with it actually goes back 3 years, almost exactly this week, when I first pitched that we start using it at Boku. We were building an application for a Fortune 500 financial company partnering with a world-class design agency, no relation to the similar circumstance mentioned yesterday, that we were building a Node app and we needed a content management system. Specifically, we needed a content management system with good editorial capabilities. And there wasn't really anything in the Node ecosystem that we could find that fit the bill. Most of the CMSs were either nascent or oriented towards developers. So we pitched using WordPress. I had been familiar with the API. It wasn't even at 1.0 yet, but we were interested in seeing whether this would fly, whether we could use this API to integrate WordPress as a component into the rest of our ecosystem and infrastructure. And it worked. We were able to build a product where the client's editorial team got the best of WordPress's editorial management plugins and interface. And we may complain about the editor with good reason, but don't forget that it's a whole lot better for a team of editors than having to learn Markdown and deal with some brand new thing that's not necessarily been tested yet. So they got the best of that world, and we got to be able to flow that data into our Node application and avoid PHP templating entirely. Everybody wins. So we've been using it in our client projects for 3 years, specifically because of the API. We would not probably be working with WordPress the way we are otherwise, save for our marketing site. We work on complex applications. They have lots of different backends. It takes something like an easy-to-use REST API to make WordPress a viable component in that ecosystem, and that's exactly what it has let us look at the API as being, a component. It's something that we can use for its strengths when we want to. It doesn't need to be something that is the be-all and end-all foundation of our platform. That said, when it is, it also makes it easier to work with. You just saw some tips about the CLI. It's great for bulk loading data, so is the API. The CLI is actually leveraging the API under the hood for a lot of things, I understand. And without being able to stand on the REST API, it would have been a lot harder for us to do some projects where we flowed dozens of spreadsheets and crazy amounts of data into WordPress in order to build data visualization dashboards and other types of experience. And that's where we were at the end of the summer last year. Talking about that type of stuff was honestly sort of what I had envisioned this talk being about, talking about building Node applications, connecting to WordPress, and pulling data out of it. But 4.7 actually sort of changed the equation a little bit, because we were building really complex, interesting things with it. Certainly human-made, 10up, Wired, all the other agencies from which you've heard talks about the API are doing equal or greater things with it. But it wasn't in core. Those content endpoints weren't available broadly. And we had set our sights on taking this API from the beginning. When Ryan first sat down to start talking about it, the idea was that this was something that belonged in WordPress. And so for 4.6, back a little over a year ago, we actually argued that we should merge in the API at that point. It definitely wasn't ready. There were way too many inconsistencies. There were way too many things that we hadn't found answers to. And so it was punted from that release. This was with good reason, but it took a while for us to sort of gather our thoughts and come back around to where we wanted to go next. And it was at the beginning of the 4.7 cycle in August that we sat down with the project leads and said, what do we need to do to get this into core? What are the remaining checkboxes we have to tick? They were meta handling, password protected posts, dealing with site settings, things that you need if you're building an interface to display data from WordPress, improved consistency across endpoints so that if you ask for something by slug on the category endpoint or the posts endpoint, both of them work. By October, we had an API that was technically ready. We had solved or had good solutions to most of these problems, and we were in the process of rolling them out. And when the merge window hit, we said, hey, we think we're ready to go. And then it almost didn't happen. The API almost did not make it into WordPress, not because of any specific technical constraints, but because we were asked a question that we didn't have a good answer for. That question was, who is this for? Who is the API serving? And the answer that we've traditionally used is that the API is for everyone. And that sounds good, right? Like, you can build all kinds of stuff on top of the API. You can build data-driven applications. You can build new editing experiences. You can completely decouple WordPress from the environment in which you're viewing and editing it, like Chrissy showed us yesterday. But that's kind of wishy-washy. The people that were using the API for these purposes were already using the API for these purposes by definition. Why does it have to be in core? What is it holding up not having these endpoints merged in? How do we prove that this satisfies the 80-20 rule, that this is truly of benefit to the majority? We were joking about what the release notes would be for the WordPress REST API. Users don't care. Saying that your software is built with an API is like saying your sculpture is made of stuff. It is true, and it is boring. I pitched that we should say WordPress now with 2% more code. That's not useful either. More code usually just means more irregularities and reasons you need to update to 4.7.2 as fast as possible. While I appreciate what Ryan said yesterday about developer user experience, WordPress is not for us. And we need to remember that the reason that we build WordPress and the reason that we have to build into WordPress conveniences for developers is so that it can continue being a product for the companies and individuals who use it for publishing around the world. And to that end, we had a lot of conversations during the 4.7 cycle about what it was that would demonstrate that the API was truly improving that whole. We ended up with what we call a conditional merge. If you saw Matt's State of the Union, State of the Word, you would have heard that he mentioned that there is still a chance that in the future we might roll the API back into a plugin. I certainly believe that it belongs in core. I think that I speak for the entire team when I say that we are making it as good as we can to serve that broader purpose, but we need to make sure that there's plugin utilization. We need to make sure that it's being consumed within core. We need to make sure that it is being used in more complex ways by the broader community. Things like authentication, we still haven't really worked out for good ways. Like the OAuth handshake is a pain, and we're trying to make it easier for plugins and for external applications to connect to WordPress remotely. This is how we're going to demonstrate that this works at scale. And that means that the REST API, first and foremost, is for core. It is for normalizing those interactions that we've been relying upon admin Ajax for. And one of the goals for 4.8, the REST API is a focus. That's why Ryan and I have been named the focus leads for the API. But the focus is not necessarily just doing whatever we want. It is focused on improving those areas where we use admin Ajax, improving core to take better advantage of the API so that it normalizes things that are inconsistent, like bulk actions, list rows, things that we could really do a lot to make faster and more responsive and more Ajaxy if we start leveraging the infrastructure that's now in place. This is the sort of stuff that will provide direct improvements to the users of WordPress. Things will work faster, more consistently. And they'll also serve as reference implementations, both for plugins and for future core features. If you're a developer thinking about how you might want to add something to WordPress, at the moment there aren't really good first-party examples of how to use the REST API. We want to change that. We want to make it so that if I say, how do I do this, I can learn from core. WordPress is an iterative cycle. It goes and learns from the outside world, brings those lessons back, implements them, and then people learn from WordPress as they learn how to develop within core. This sort of activity will also highlight what the API cannot do right now. Things like date formatting, not formatting, I'm sorry, date management are inconsistent with how drafts are created. There is no support for menus or widgets natively. We're working on those in separate plugins. There's a lot of areas for improvement, and these are pieces that we're going to be trying to strengthen over the rest of the year because they're the pieces that will enable new core interfaces. And they'll also enable plugin developers to work more in ways that they haven't been able to before. I'm not really a plugin developer myself. I write a lot of plugins, but they're usually deployed on GitHub and just handed over to a client. I'd not released anything publicly. So when we started debating about whether 4.7 should merge in, I was actually surprised by the voice of the plugin community that said, no, we need this. Because WordPress is a content platform. Everything comes from the content. And if you have a plugin that is dealing with SEO or content editing or laying out a page in a certain way, all of those concerns touch on content. So you can make your own endpoints, and a lot of people have been. But if you can't get access to the content data that's under the hood, those endpoints aren't necessarily going to be super useful on their own. So many plugin developers were saying, we need these endpoints in core, or we're just going to go make our own. And to quote Joost de Valk, if everyone makes their own, that's going to be a nightmare for people that are trying to integrate multiple plugins that have multiple inconsistent implementations of the post object or of the category object. The specific analogy was as if all these plugins were just dumping stuff into the same MySQL table without really coordinating their schema changes. It would have been a disaster. And so having these endpoints in core provides a baseline of consistent access to common WordPress data. This is a foundation for plugin developers. It's also a vote of confidence in backwards compatibility. There were a lot of small agencies that spoke up and said, we can't use this because we can't keep tracking with a plugin that isn't 2.0 primary version backwards compatible. And we can't even necessarily keep tracking it as a plugin. We don't have plugin dependency management. Maybe if we did, this wouldn't have been as big an issue to not have it be part of core, but we don't have plugin dependency management. And I think Brian Richards spoke up in the debates about whether to merge and said, this is not a burden that we should put on users. Those banners that say, to use this, you have to use something else, they really only work if you want to install the other thing. Like you can install WooCommerce and then install an add-on for it, but you want both of those things. Users don't want the API, they want the stuff that you can do with it. And that's just not something you want to have to put your users through to say, no, in order to use this, you have to go do all of these other things. Having the classes in core not only enables all of these plugins to work out of the box, it also provides primitives that can be extended by plugins so that they can model their own data much more efficiently. This has been a little bit of a narrative-heavy talk for the first 15 minutes or so, so who would like to see some code? We're going to build a little React journaling application. We're going to create a custom post type. We're going to model the data for it, and then we're going to build a UI to show how you can get this rendering on the front end and take in data through the API to create posts. By the way, thank you to, I think it was Natalie and Nathan yesterday who gave that amazing talk. That is like 4 days of content crammed into 35 minutes. I strongly encourage anyone who's interested in the React ecosystem to dig into those links and resources because that is a lot of information to take in very quickly. Hopefully, you will all be prepared. And before we begin, I'm going to talk a little bit about a library that we released at Boku to create, to make a utility to make it easier to get data out of the API. It's called WPAPI. It's on the Node package registry npm. And it's pretty simple. You require it into your project, and it's a query builder and an HTTP layer. So you can use it to describe a resource that you want to access or update with the chaining syntax. Is that big enough? More or less. So you can say like site.posts.perpage20, and you'll get the 20 first posts in your archive. And it uses promise syntax so that you can make that request and get the data back and then do something with it. Alternatively, you can use different resources. It provides handlers for all of the built-in WordPress data types. So I can say, get me the comments before March 31st, 2016, and then start paging through that data. If you want to start doing more complex queries, you can query by taxonomy. The API natively supports querying by taxonomy terms. This is a frequently asked question, but you can just do tags equals and then the ID of a tag, and that'll get you posts that are associated with that tag. Same with categories. So we provide a syntax for that as well. We can say site.posts tags 37 and 42, and that'll get you posts that are in tags 37 or 42. If you want to do it by slug, there's one more step. There's actually a typo in the code on this slide, so don't try it until I get the slides up after the talk. But you can make requests by slug for the two categories. And then you can take the IDs of those records that come back, and you can use them to make a post request as well. So there's not direct ability to query by slug in the API because slugs are much more mutable than IDs. They're less reliable, but it is possible if you do a two-step jump. Pagination is pretty big in the API because WordPress would explode if you requested every post from Wired.com simultaneously. I think actually California might light on fire. MySQL is just not really set up to handle that, and certainly not our connection to it. So we paginate our data collections. We start with one page of data, and then you can request the next page and the next page and the next page and go on from there. These are exposed by headers by default. If you use the envelope parameter, they'll be wrapped up in one data object if your server doesn't support headers. But the client that we created will read those headers when they come back, and it'll make a little paging property that'll let you step to the previous or the next page of a collection. So you can pretty quickly iterate through all posts on a site if you want to pull them down and work on them in memory. Although, again, for a large site, you're going to overrun the browser or Node's memory limitations if you try to maintain the state for an entire large site. So generally, you're going to want to save that out and work on it in a temporary database or file. So we've got paging, we've got filtering collections, we've got complex queries, and we also have the ability to create, read, and update posts. Using the same chaining syntax, in this case we're going to authenticate, we're going to use a nonce so that we can use WordPress's built-in cookie authentication. We'll look at how this works specifically in a couple slides. And we're going to create a post. We're going to send a title and some content because those are required in order to populate the post. And it's going to go out, send that request to the API, authenticate using the cookie that you have in your login session, and then return you the object representing that post once it's been created. Now you have access to things like the ID that only gets set when you save a post. So that's the utility that we're going to use to paper over some of the specifics of the interactions with the API. And we're going to combine it with React. We saw a little bit about React yesterday. It's a great front-end UI library. I really enjoy it. It's certainly not necessary to work with the API. Neither of these things are. You don't need to use my library. You don't need to use Adam Silverstein's backbone client that's part of WordPress itself. You can make a request to the API just with curl or jQuery or fetch or Axios, SuperAgent, any library that you have. I'm just naming the JavaScript ones because that's my world. But you can connect to it from Python, Go, Ruby. However you can make an HTTP request, you can interact with the WordPress API, REST API. But in this case, we're going to look at JavaScript because the current authentication scheme that we have in the API is that the only built-in way to authenticate is if you're inside a plugin or a theme and you have access to the WordPress login cookie. We'll be enhancing that. As I mentioned, that's a priority for this next development cycle is improving authentication. But right now, the application we're going to build is going to be something that's going to run within a WordPress page. This is what it looks like. It's a little journaling app. Can just post some little personal diary, live journal style, currently listening to type thing. And we're going to model this data using a post type. That post type is fairly standard. If you've created a post type before, there's nothing new here except for show and rest true. That's what it will take to say use the posts collection class that we have in WordPress, but for our custom post type. So you don't even have to write a class to represent this in the API. Just by doing show and rest true, it's exposed on the WPV2 namespace. And then we have to give it a rest base so that we know, well, we don't have to. It'll default to the name of the post type, but it's better if we do because it's usually easier to remember. So we're going to say that in this case, we'll be able to access our data at WPv2 journal entries. We're going to set the public flag to false because we're actually not going to interact with this data through the WordPress admin at all. We're just going to have it be solely through this little application that we're going to build. And we want more than just that title and editor. So we've also said that we have support for custom fields. If you're going to be using register meta later on, you need the custom fields to be declared here. And we're going to be using register REST field instead of register meta because register meta still has a weakness where it's not possible to register meta just for one custom post type. So if you say register meta, it's going to be for all types of post. And it's going to show up as a key in those responses, whether you want to populate it or not. So register REST field is still the best bet for data modeling for a specific custom post type. Before we get to JavaScript, the final piece we need is some HTML into which to render our application. So we'll use some code borrowed from another plugin to create a custom page template that we can select within WordPress. I'm just going to go in, well, I already have gone in, created a page in my local dev instance, given it this template. And that template has the header and footer and an empty div in the middle with the ID root, so that in our React entry point, we can tell React DOM to render our app into that root. That app component will, similarly to what you saw yesterday, be a wrapper for the application that we've created. And what we're going to do to start is in our constructor, we're going to say we're going to have state down the road. That state's going to be entries. It's going to be an array of journal post entries. But for now, the render method we're going to create is just a hello world. It's just saying, hello LoopConf. And there it is. In order to work with the API, we're going to have to set up that cookie authentication in order for us to read this data out, because journals are private. We're going to have this be private data. So using WP enqueue script, we're actually going to use the WP localize script method to inject not translation data, but instead the URL of our REST endpoint, the WP JSON URL at which we can access the rest of the API, and a nonce, a value that will be combined with the cookie in order to let our script authenticate. Back in the app file, we're going to pull in the WPAPI module and instantiate that and connect it to the endpoint that we got from the localized script and give it that nonce for authentication. We're also going to use a method on this library called register route, which is a convenience utility that mirrors the register route method in PHP. It lets you say, there is a post type that this library doesn't support natively. Here's where it lives. Here's how to access it. And so we pass it the same type of route string that we would if we were setting this up as a custom route in the PHP space. We'll just read this off of the index and copy it over. So we know we're in the WPv2 namespace because we're using show and rest true. And our posts are going to be at journal entries, which is our REST base, and they will be identified by ID. With that in place, we can actually, at this point, create the method that will go out and get our data. Component DidMount is a React lifecycle method that fires when the React component has first rendered into a page. So on component DidMount, we'll update our data. What that means is that once the React component has first rendered, it'll send that AJAX request out to the API. We'll use our journal entries method that we just created. We're going to look for private entries, and we're going to get them in the edit context. Context is a little confusing with the API. You can either have a view context, which gives you things like your rendered post content, or your edit context, which requires authentication because it's editorially oriented, but it gives you access to the raw data that you actually put into the post editor before things like WPAPI, etc. So we'll go out, we'll make this request, and then when it comes back, we're going to set the state on our React component, and those entries will be stored within the state for this component. So we can then iterate over them and say, for each one of these, give me a div that contains the header and the date. If we were building this from scratch, we wouldn't have any data yet, but we actually have a couple posts here already, so we can see in this case that this is where we've gotten to so far. We're getting data back from WordPress, we're rendering it out on the page with really only a very few lines of code. So now let's start building some more React components so that we can get that editing form in place. We're going to take the iteration through those posts and we're going to wrap it in an entry list component. And then we're going to make an entry composer component, which is just a form. It's a regular old HTML form that happens to be rendered through React and happens to have a couple additional methods to take those text areas and inputs and make them into a data object that we can send somewhere when we submit that form. So on submit, again, we turn to the API library and we say, take our journal entries, and in this case, rather than fetching some, create one. Create one with the title, the content, and the music that we have specified, and set it to private. When the request is done, update is called again to refresh the list. Switch over my shoulder. There's a couple pieces that we're not going to go over. For example, this does require the authentication, so there's some additional code that is in this plugin on GitHub that will let you show an error screen if you're not logged in. But if you are logged in, and then we can go in and create this post, and then there's additionally a little bit more code that will overload that save method that we created so that we can also update if we are editing a post that's already been published. This probably feels, as with most things like React, a little bit like how to draw an owl. You know, have you seen that one? Or how to break dance? It's like step one, now you're done. We skip some steps. The reason that, I don't know, the whole learn JavaScript deeply thing, I really love JavaScript. I think it's a fantastic language. I think we can do some amazing things in it. But learn JavaScript deeply is so unbounded as a mandate. We really need to focus. You need to pick your battles with JavaScript. You can make something really cool with the REST API with jQuery and nothing else. You can make something really cool with the REST API with the Backbone client that's built into WordPress. You don't have to learn ES6 and Webpack and React. There's value to doing so. There's problems that they make it easier to solve. But don't get disheartened if the landscape of a particular technology feels confusing, because it's just as viable to make an application today with Backbone as it is with React. It doesn't feel as modern, but it does work, and there's something to that. And unlike the how to draw an owl, all the code for this one is on GitHub. So I would encourage you all, if you're interested, to dig through it. Please ask questions. I wrote this app yesterday, so the code could probably be cleaned up. If you find anything that doesn't make sense, just open an issue, ask the question, and I'll respond right there. So that's how you do some data modeling and build a little application using React and the REST API. I'm running low on time, but I didn't want to leave you with a head full of React spinning. But I actually instead wanted to talk about one final thing, which is going back to that notion of who is the API for. And we've seen that it is for core. It is for plugin developers. It is for the agencies and companies and individuals who are building applications to connect to it. But the API serves one additional type of user. In a way, it's the first example of what Ryan was talking about yesterday around something that papers over the inconsistencies that are within WordPress. And that facade, I think that I inadvertently dubbed it the jQuery of the WordPress database last night. It takes a whole bunch of inconsistency and it gives you a consistent way to interact with it. That's very powerful. And both jQuery and other tools like it still have a very important place in the ecosystem. And that's because we always will be coming up with the next great thing. There's a great quote by one of my heroes in our industry, Rebecca Murphy, that every technology decision is eventually regrettable. We look back on the code we wrote last week and think, oh, why did I do that? We look back on the code from the first days of WordPress and think, that's still there? Anyone who's worked on core, by the way, every so often I've been at conferences where people have asked, like, do you work on applications that have been maintained for over 10 years? You do if you're a core contributor. We regret our past code, but our past code was the best code that we had at the time. I learned to code by making WordPress sites. I started by changing CSS in themes for local businesses in my area of Boston. Slowly I learned JavaScript, I learned jQuery, and then I began to understand better how PHP worked and how I could build a theme and how I could make something interactive. And then I started to see things on the horizon like Backbone and this REST API thing that it took me years to understand what that was. And I moved away, I started working on Sitecore projects, and when I came back to the community, WordPress had evolved in my absence, and we had Backbone, we had Admin Ajax, we had ways to use modern things inside WordPress, and I realized, oh, if we'd had these when I was getting started, the process of understanding how to use them would have been easier. Because WordPress is one of the best communities in the world in which to learn to program. I believe this very strongly, not just because it's where I come from, but because there are a lot of technical ecosystems out there in the world. We've mentioned React, that's confusing, jQuery, which is easy, but maybe you hit an upper bound at some point. They're all very specific, and they're all oriented towards technology. WordPress has this amazing attribute where we are oriented towards users, and you can be a proficient WordPress user just without any code whatsoever. But it's there if you want to. And through the magic of open source, you have the right to take it and experiment and learn. And through all the people in this room and at every WordCamp around the world and all of the other events that have sprung up around WordPress, you have a tremendous community of people that you can learn from. I think of WordPress kind of as a ramp. Because it's old, because it's grown steadily, and because it's always absorbed knowledge and learning from the community around it, it is a very gradual ramp that you can climb on your growth as a programmer if you're interested. And you can pick an aspect that works well for you. Today, a new generation of developers around the world is making WordPress sites. They're learning CSS, they're muddling their way through the various hooks and filters in PHP templates. They're trying to figure out what this jQuery thing is, since no one seems to be talking about it anymore, but it's all over the place inside WordPress. And then they get to a point maybe where they have a sense of what they want to build and they understand the underlying infrastructure in WordPress, but they want something really interactive, and they've heard a little bit about these other technologies and they want to understand how they fit in. With the REST API, inside our community, we have an answer for them. I would always advocate to go and learn from other systems and learn from the way other people do things and to bring that knowledge back. But having the ability for somebody to go from, I don't know code at all, to I can build a very powerful single-page application on top of a very modern REST API, all inside the same community with the same support network and the same mentors, and the ability to access some of the best PHP and JavaScript developers in the world through Slack and code review, that's really cool. We all came to WordPress and wanted it to do more. Anyone who's contributed to core has helped push it forward. The people who have yet to join our community are going to push it still farther forward. And the REST API I see as being the first step towards that future. This is why I will continue to be involved in the project. This is what excites me about WordPress's future. I can't wait to hear, above all else, the one thing that I would look forward to the most is in another 10 years' time, whatever WordPress has become, what are the people that have yet to join our community saying about the code that we write today? Thank you.